This is the second lecture for Friday, April 17th, and we're talking about nutrient cycling before we get into the specifics of nitrogen, carbon, phosphate, those kind of nutrients, and water as well. We're looking at how nutrients in general are cycled, although those are the nutrients that we're talking about are nitrogen, phosphate, sulfur, and potassium, calcium, those kind of things. And in the first lecture, we saw how nutrient cycling took place on land in terrestrial ecosystems, the importance of detritus, variability of detritus formation, and the big amount of nutrients that are in detritus and relatively quick turnover sometimes from the soil back into living things, plants, through bacteria, through mycorrhizae, the fungi that produce these sheaths around the roots of plants. So it's a pretty short distance. The plant's roots are in the soil, and it's oftentimes a pretty short time that it takes for these nutrients to be recycled. That's how it is in terrestrial situations. In aquatic systems, it's very different. You don't have soil the same way that you have soil in terrestrial settings. You have sediments that are on the bottom. You don't have all this air and aerobic situation. Sometimes you use up the oxygen in this setting underwater, and then you have anaerobic conditions take place. And the location of these nutrients on land is very close. In fact, the roots of the plants are in the soil. They're all embedded in the soil. It's just they're touching the soil where these nutrients are. In aquatic systems, if there's plants, then it might be a similar situation. But a huge part of the aquatic ecosystems on land, in the ocean, in fact, and in some freshwater situations, the primary producers are not plants. They're phytoplankton. They're up at the surface. And where are all the nutrients? All the nutrients are down at the bottom. The average depth of the ocean is about 4,000 meters. So on average, you've got these phytoplankton up at the surface within the top 100 meters of the surface, and you've got all the sediments, all the nitrogen, phosphate, calcium, potassium, magnesium, all these things that have died and sunk to the bottom as opposed to dying and falling onto the ground as in a forest. They're thousands of meters away from the primary producers. Now that's a whole different situation. And it's one of the reasons why the primary producers in the ocean are these tiny little microscopic things as opposed to plants, big giant plants. So what happens in aquatic systems? I want to contrast what happens in terrestrial settings as we go along, because they're very different from one another. You've got the nutrients in a dead phytoplankton, zooplankton, a dead whale. Doesn't matter what it is. It's dead, sinks to the bottom. And now you've got all these nutrients a long ways away from the organisms that need those, a long ways away from the pathway by which they're going to be recycled. So regeneration, nutrient regeneration, as opposed to terrestrial situations, in the ocean and aquatic systems, it tends to be relatively slow. It can take hundreds of years for the nutrients to make their way up off the bottom and be incorporated into living things again. Whereas in the soil, nowhere near that long. So, where do you have nutrients where there's photosynthetic organisms? Well, one place that you have those is close to shore, close to land. You've got nutrients coming off the land. You've got fresh water bringing nutrients into the ocean when you're close to shore. And in shallow situations, where there's a lot of sunlight, the photosynthetic organisms are going to be up in the top layer of the water where they can get light and where they can be photosynthetic. But you have to have this combination, this two factors. You've got to have nutrients and you've got to have sunlight in order for primary productivity to take place at high levels in the ocean or even in big bodies of fresh water. So where do you find that place? As I said, in shallow water close to shore. Those are the most productive waters. And if there's situations where the water is being brought up from down deep, situations where you have upwelling, then those are also productive. In fact, they're more productive than any other parts of the ocean. So if you look around the world, if you look at the ocean and you look at where primary production is taking place or where phytoplankton are photosynthesizing, it should be no surprise that most of this is close to shore, and the biggest parts of the ocean in terms of primary production are where there's upwelling. So if you look at this map and you see all this red, it's measuring chlorophyll, net primary production of carbon. So that's phytoplankton that's involved in photosynthesis, that's taking carbon out of the water, basically, and joining those carbons together to make sugar. That's photosynthesis. If you look at the bright red parts of this map, you see where it is, close to shore. And if you look at South America, for instance, and Africa, on the west coast of South Africa and the west coast of South America and the west coast of Africa, notice the big giant red splotches there compared to the east side of those continents. That's where all this upwelling is because of the way that the currents work. And so it's close to shore where there's a lot of nutrients and it's shallow. Plus, if you throw in upwelling, those are the most productive parts of the ocean. A lot of the rest of the ocean, the nutrients are a long ways away from where all the photosynthesis is going on. If it's not shallow and you don't have upwelling, then it could take a long time for these nutrients to make their way up to the surface. Another thing that interferes with nutrient cycling, or getting nutrients from the bottom up to the surface, is the stratification of the water column. So there's a kind of a barrier to mixture of deep water with shallow water. And two of the things that are most common in terms of producing stratification, or the waters not mixing, in other words, being stratified, are thermal stratification. You have thermoclines. Above the thermocline, the water's mixed. You have a lot of mixing, you have a lot of nutrients. Those nutrients can be used up pretty quickly. But above that thermocline, you've got a lot of mixing. Below the thermocline, you don't have much mixing. You don't have a mixing between in the waters above and below the thermocline. So you have all these nutrients that are down deep that don't make their way up. Salinity is another stratification. You've got some, especially in estuaries, you've got some differing salinities that really keep bodies of water from mixing. So everywhere that you go out in the ocean where you have bodies of water, you have currents that are moving past one another, you have wind blowing that's taking water offshore or downshore, any place where you've got bodies of water that are mixing together or that are interacting, those tend to be areas where the water down deep can move up to replace the water above it. When that water moves offshore or it moves along the shore, or you get this turbulent mixing, now that's where you have nutrients being brought up from the depth, maybe not all the way down to the bottom, but down deeper and brought to the surface. Those are areas where there's a lot of primary production because there's a lot of nutrients. Now, it's not just sunlight, because even the little phytoplankton, they need to grow. They're not necessarily getting bigger, but they're making things. They're joining things together. They need carbon, for one, but they also need nitrogen and need phosphate for their own purposes. They're making proteins. They're making RNA. They're making DNA when they're reproducing. And when they're maintaining their cells, So they need those nutrients. Without those nutrients, they could have a lot of sun, but they're still not going to be able to photosynthesize that much. So a lot of focus on the ocean. Now, granted, the ocean deserves a lot of attention because the ocean is huge in comparison to the other water on Earth. So what about besides the ocean? In lakes, there's a lot of lakes that are shallow, so there's a lot of light. In fact, you have sediments on the bottom where plants can grow. And they're not deep enough for stratification, and it's not thousands of meters that these nutrients have to go. So lakes can be pretty productive. Lakes can have a fairly high turnover rate for nutrients compared to the ocean, certainly. And there's also the changing temperatures as the stratification disappears in lakes in the fall and the spring. When the water warms up, it creates a thermocline. But when the body of water cools down, it eliminates that thermocline, and you have this mixing in the spring and the fall. You have turnover, which facilitates bringing nutrients to the surface. Estuaries and marshes, we saw how productive these were. The huge amount of primary production there. A lot of nutrients, a lot of sunlight, nutrients coming from the shore, nutrients coming from all the vegetation that's in those swamps and estuaries. So there's a lot of primary production. If the water moves, like in estuaries, then there's a lot of energy that's transferred to other ecosystems, like offshore into the continental shelf waters from estuaries. And then another situation, aquatic ecosystem situation, is streams. This will be the last thing that we'll look at. Is if you look at nutrient cycling in streams. Now, streams are moving. The water's moving downstream, obviously. And so with streams, there's a spiraling of nutrients where the nutrients are going downstream, but there's some mechanisms for also bringing the nutrients back upstream. So if we look at this figure and you look at this fish that's got the loops around it, this nutrient transport, there's nutrient transport by the water moving downstream, but there's nutrient uptake by different plants. There's nutrient movement upstream by organisms as well. And so a characteristic of nutrient cycling in streams is this idea of nutrient spiraling, where the nutrients are moving downstream in the water, but they're moving upstream to a certain extent within organisms. Different streams with different depths and different strengths of water flow. This water flowing very fast, very slow. Different streams with different characteristics have different nutrient spiraling lengths, and they have different capabilities of retaining nutrients or nutrient retentiveness in terms of how long it's retained in the living things versus how quickly it's transported downstream. So that's the kind of situation that you see in streams. Okay, so when we come back on Monday, then we'll look at this idea of disturbance. We looked at disturbance and we concentrated on the effects of disturbance when we were looking at succession, ecological succession. So this is going to have a big influence on nutrient cycling. That's what we'll look at on Monday.